This video is sponsored by War Thunder. The US Army once designed a weapon for a very specific tactic, but that tactic never really had a chance to be tested. The weapon stuck around though, all the way until the next World War came and gave it a completely different role. So you're about to see the hell of the BAR gunners in war, and why this weapon stayed in service all the way to Vietnam. Okay, now let's start with the birth of the BAR, which, if you somehow didn't know, stands for Browning Automatic Rifle. And how this rifle came to be and was then used is quite a plot twist that no one could predict. It all started with the First World War and a bunch of problems that trench warfare brought on that no one could really solve effectively. Machine guns transformed the battlefield and helped cause the deadlock of trenches, but they couldn't help solve it. They were all too heavy, as the main design at the time was Maxim's water-cooled machine gun that was crew-served, about 70 pounds without water. And although a great defensive weapon, it wasn't exactly something you'd want to carry running across the cratered, muddy no-man's land. The thing is that the standard infantry weapon back then was the bolt-action rifle. You have 5 rounds in stripper clips, and a well-trained soldier could put out about 15 aimed shots per minute. That was fine for shooting from the trench maybe, but when you want to attack, you can't bring the suppressive firepower with you. Now, armies did try to work around this. The standard approach was called fire and movement, where part of your unit stops and shoots while the rest advances, then they swap. But this slowed the whole assault down. Only a portion of your force was actually shooting. And stopping to shoot in the middle of no man's land was also not something you should do if you'd like to stay alive. Before an attack, the artillery would bomb the enemy trenches, and the enemy would go down into dugouts where they were relatively well protected. As the attacking side would leave their trenches to cross no man's land, the artillery had to stop firing, and then the defending side had enough time to go out, man their machine guns, and mow down infantry just in front of their barbed wire. With bolt-action rifles, they couldn't suppress the defenders long enough to fill that gap between the artillery barrage ending and attackers reaching the enemy line. So the US Army, like the other armies at the time, was working on a solution for this gap. Something lighter than the water-cooled Maxim that only Schwarzenegger could carry in assault, but also something that could provide somewhat sustained, suppressive fire, better than the 5-round bolt action. Something to let the soldiers carry automatic fire with them. And before we get into that, this video is sponsored by War Thunder, which is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game out there, and it's available right now for free on PC, consoles, and mobile. You get over 2,500 vehicles, tanks, planes, helicopters, ships from 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armoured cars of the 1920s, all the way up to modern jets and main battle tanks. The combat in War Thunder is intense, and with incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound design, it really does place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. For fans of military history, there's hardly a better game. You've got an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, over 95 million players to join in epic PvP battles, and the whole thing is just a breathtaking experience. And the best part about it, it's free to play on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. Now, one of my favourite things they've done is the damage X-ray view. When a vehicle gets knocked out, War Thunder actually shows you what happened inside, so you'd see where the shell penetrated, which components got hit, what caused the kill, and so on. Use our links in the pinned comment or the video description to sign up. For a limited time only, new players and returning players who haven't played in at least 6 months get a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles. That includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account time. This is a limited offer, so don't miss it. The French actually came up with an answer. I mean, it would have been an answer if the thing actually worked in the mud, but the idea was good. I'm talking about the Chauchat. It was the first automatic weapon in rifle caliber that a single soldier could carry into a fight. But although it made sense on paper, the weapon itself performed horribly in trench conditions. Its open-sided magazine, which was supposedly designed so the gunner could see how many rounds he had left, in practice just let mud straight into the feeding system. The Americans then took the Chauchat and converted it to their 30-06 cartridge, which worked even worse than the already notoriously unreliable French version. However, even before Browning came up with the right solution, the Americans already had a working, portable automatic weapon. They just threw it away. That's the Lewis gun, that machine gun, with the pan magazine on top and the big barrel shroud, and the one that became hugely popular with the British. Well, that was an American design. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis developed it around 1911, and it was literally the kind of solution the American Army was now looking for. Because of a bitter personal rivalry between Lewis and the chief of the Army's Ordnance Department, the weapon was blocked from adoption. Lewis got so angry that he packed up his design and left the country in 1913, went to Belgium and then Britain, where people recognized what he had built. And it gets worse. The US Marines did adopt the Lewis gun, and they had them when they arrived in France in 1917. The Army, however, took them away and replaced them with Chauchats. So American troops went into combat with arguably the worst automatic weapon on the Western Front, mostly because of an argument between two people. Now, going back to the BAR story, at the time Browning was working on his design, there were various different attempts to find the right thing for the walking fire concept the generals wanted, but most of them eventually hit dead ends for one reason or another. So the best American gun designer of all time was now working on a new rifle that had to be chambered in .30-06 to fire in both semi and full auto, to not get wrecked by the mud and trench conditions, and to have larger capacity than the bolt-action rifle, of course. Browning took a completely different approach and used a gas-operated system. The only things moving inside the gun are the piston, the operating rod, and the bolt. So, unlike the Chauchat that was just horrible to fire, the recoil of the BAR is much more consistent and predictable, which is exactly what you need when a soldier is trying to fire this thing while walking across a battlefield. The finished weapon weighed around 16 pounds, which made it lighter than the Lewis gun at over 20 pounds, and also useful for aimed shots. The sights came from the model of 1917 Enfield rifle, which were great, and it fed from a 20-round box magazine, although 40-round magazines were tested, but proved too awkward for prone firing and were mostly set aside. So you've heard me mention the walking fire tactic that the BAR was specifically built for. The thing is that soldiers armed with these new automatic rifles would advance toward enemy positions while firing, mainly from the hip and in semi-automatic mode. This was intended to keep enemy heads down long enough to fill that gap when they'd start coming out of their dugouts. Then, once the assault got to very close range, the soldier would switch to full automatic for short bursts during the final rush to clear the trench. Browning designed the fire selector deliberately stiff, so you'd have to make a real effort to move it. It travelled from safe, which was the position closest to the shooter, forward to semi-automatic, then forward again to full automatic. A spring-loaded stop made switching from semi to auto easy and quick, but going back to safe was intentionally difficult, so that a soldier switching modes under stress in the middle of a fight couldn't accidentally put his weapon on safe at the worst possible moment. The BAR also came with 3 different belt configurations, one for the gunner, one for the first assistant, and one for the second assistant. The gunner's belt had a metal cup mounted on the right side, designed to hold and support the butt during walking fire. By the war's end, roughly 52,000 M1918 BARs had been produced, and about 48,000 of them shipped overseas to France. Even though they were arriving in France by the summer of 1918, American units at the front continued using Chauchats, while BARs piled up in reserve depots behind the lines. General Pershing was worried that deploying the BAR in small numbers in early engagements would give the Germans a chance to capture examples, figure out how they worked, and start making their own. At the time, commanders on both sides still expected the war to continue well into 1919, with major offensives planned for the spring. Pershing saw the BAR as a decisive weapon and didn't want to give away the advantage too early. His plan was to field it in massive numbers all at once, equipping entire divisions simultaneously. The actual first combat use came just before the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where it performed exceptionally well. Since the weapon had limited time in the field and saw very few actions, early tests mostly measured how well the BAR held up in mud. Nevertheless, when it did see combat, it absolutely terrified Germans who had never seen or heard anything like it, and definitely not in such a light package. But the war ended before the BAR could ever be truly tested in the walking fire role it was specifically built for, and that kind of trench fighting would never be repeated. After quiet years sitting in warehouses, Browning's creation was going to enter a new war, and in a completely different role. But before World War II began, the BAR had its run-ins with criminals, and then with the police who had to respond to the threat by creating their own version of the weapon. You see, weapons were sitting in weakly secured facilities during the difficult years between the 2 world wars, so gangs raided these depots and took a bunch of BARs from them. Clyde Barrow, for example, made the BAR his signature weapon. He shortened the barrel and stock, welded 3 magazines together, and loaded 60 rounds. And because the gang's overpowered police, who were armed mostly with shotguns and revolvers, now suddenly fighting against World War I machine guns, it led to taxing and banning fully automatic weapons. But it also led to the Colt R80 Monitor, basically a similar modification of the BAR to what the gangs did, just made for the police to even out the firepower. So with another global war about to break out, the US Army decided to use everything they had to prepare, but they still didn't really have anything to fill the role of a squad automatic weapon. There were M1 Garands as the standard infantry weapon, M1919 and M1917 machine guns, with tripods which were crew-served, the M250 caliber of course, but that was a heavy machine gun. And then there were submachine guns, first just the Thompson, and later the M3 so-called grease gun, which were in 45 ACP, a pistol caliber. So they looked around and said, BAR it is. But because there were no trenches this time to walk fire toward, they updated the World War I BAR into the M1918A2 version, which was an attempt to turn it into a light machine gun. When we say light machine gun, though, the soldiers who carried it would probably have had some other choice of words for the reasons you're about to hear, because this update actually made everything worse for the poor soul who had to carry it in combat. Semi-auto was cut out and replaced with 2 fully automatic modes. One was about 350 rounds per minute with a hydraulic buffer mechanism to slow down the fire for better precision, at least in theory, while the second one was about 600 rounds per minute, the standard rate. But this rate reducer turned out to be nothing more than a pain in the arse once it got dirty, in conditions like, let's say, a battlefield. Then they added a bipod at the muzzle, which caused barrel flex and hurt accuracy, while adding weight and making aiming more difficult than it needed to be. Speaking of aiming, the perfectly good Enfield rear sight that soldiers loved was replaced for some reason, and other adjustments were made to the stock to make it more suitable for prone firing rather than walking fire like the original. So you ended up with somewhere around £20 instead of 16 for the same weapon that was now supposed to be a light machine gun. The only problem is that the BAR was never designed to be a light machine gun. It didn't have a quick change barrel system, which by the way was offered to the US Army before the war by the Belgian FN, who came up with it along with a better rate reducer, and was kindly declined. And with a 20-round magazine that's empty in 3 seconds, sustained fire goes out the window. Pretty soon after deploying, soldiers took down all the quote-unquote improvements of the new model and put it back close to the original configuration. It worked, though, and there wasn't anything better to replace it with, so almost 200,000 BARs were produced during World War II alone. The American squad was organized with the BAR as its main automatic weapon. It was supposed to be operated by a 3-man team of gunner, assistant, and ammo bearer, but in practice it all fell on the guy who carried the gun, while the rest of the squad helped carry the magazines. The gunner had 11 magazines, giving him 220 rounds, and quite the weight on top of his standard gear. And because the BAR was the single most important weapon in the squad, and because the enemy knew that too, and did their best to take out the guys carrying it first, all squad members received basic BAR training. This was so that if, God forbid, something happened to the BAR gunner, someone else could pick up the gun and keep firing. The previous owner couldn't really mind someone taking his weapon anyway. As for the Germans, they quite liked and respected the BAR, at least when it wasn't firing at them. Poland had some 20,000 BARs in service when it fell, so the Germans took them as well as any American BAR they could get their hands on, and put them to use, mostly with rear units and for partisan fighting, but they did use them for the entire war. Although they had superior weapons to most Allied forces, the Germans didn't have anything quite like the BAR, except the FG-42 paratroop rifle. This one was similar, with the 20-round magazine and bipod, but there were only about 7,000 built in total, so their main firepower always came from the MG-34 and MG-42, while the infantry was largely armed with bolt-action Kar-98 rifles, machine pistols, and later the STG-44, which also came in small numbers. This way, if the machine gun got knocked out, they were left without that firepower, unlike the American squad where it was dispersed throughout, compensating for inferior machine guns with semi-auto rifles and BARs. And when the BAR went to the other side of the world and fought the Japanese in the Pacific Island hopping campaign, it became, after the flamethrower, arguably the second most important weapon there. Fighting was in jungles and on ridges at extremely close range, because the Japanese always wanted to close the distance with the Americans, making it too risky for American artillery to fire without hitting their own troops. This meant that the M1 Garand wasn't giving enough firepower for that kind of close, chaotic fighting. But the submachine guns that would otherwise be ideal for this scenario struggled in thick jungle vegetation. You couldn't really swing the M1919 around and fire it from the hip. I mean, you could, and soldiers did that sometimes, but it wasn't the most practical thing to do. So what was left to fill the gap but Browning's World War I rifle? By 1944, Marine squads had reorganized into 3 4-man fire teams, and each fire team had at least one BAR. Just a year before, there were about 500 BARs per Marine division, and by 1945, that number had jumped to about 850 because of combat experience. So you see what they thought about it. The Japanese had pretty much nothing but bolt-action rifles, with crew-served light machine guns as their only source of automatic fire. And when they ran into American Marines carrying nothing but semi and fully automatic weapons, well, they quickly learned that banzai charges weren't the greatest tactic in the world. This is why the defense on Iwo Jima, for example, was organized completely differently compared to previous battles, where such charges were almost never attempted. Captured Japanese documents noted that American divisions had 5 to 6 times the firepower of their own. So they had to lean on surprise, aggressiveness, night attacks, and staying as close to the American lines as they could. Then, after the war ended, the BAR stayed in service as the main squad automatic weapon through the Korean War, and it was even still being used in the early years of the Vietnam War. Later, it was also still around in some special roles, like with the gun truck units, where they wanted heavy stopping power and didn't mind the weight. It was finally replaced by the M60, the first American general purpose machine gun in the new NATO caliber, which was belt-fed, had a quick-change barrel system, and could be carried by a single soldier. But the BAR made it from the trenches of World War I in 1918, unexpectedly, all the way to the Vietnam War, and still worked on a battlefield that was a completely different dimension than the one it was designed for. And before you go, War Thunder is free to play right now on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. Use my links in the pinned comment or the video description to sign up. New players and returning players who haven't played in at least 6 months get a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles. That includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. This is available for a limited time, so don't miss it.